Thanks so much on a Sunday morning here. And I couldn't be more delighted to be here with this fabulous group of panelists. I think, given that we started a little bit late rather than sort of too long introduction, I just want to turn the panel over to Salomé for our first contribution. So as we've been doing, each of them will talk for more sort of around 15 minutes, and then we'll have a time for discussion.
Great, thanks so much. Can everyone hear me? It's pretty loud. Hope they're messy. Great. So thanks for everyone for being here. I'm like really honored to be on this great panel with you all. So I'm presenting like very early stage work here. That's really just sort of trying to drill down into like a particular context of data collection. I really work on data governance, data collection, to explore the relationship between biological reproduction and datafication in this sort of particular era of informational capitalism that we find ourselves in. I think looking at fertility data, which is what I'm interested in here, is just a really interesting place where the rubber kind of hits the road in terms of how market forces drive our social relations to be datafied, to make money for companies, and a place where it's just sort of really key to understanding what about us is being datafied and why. And also kind of a place where I believe sort of our legal responses to that are just sort of pervasively missing or naturalizing what makes the datafication of social life, in this case, biological processes of reproduction, powerful and potentially risky. So I kind of want to just walk through a couple of questions, get into some of the stuff I've been looking at, to just tee up a conversation, because again, this is preliminary kind of work for me. So the first is thinking about, what is fertility data and reproductive surveillance? Like, what are we thinking of? What counts as fertility data? So in an era of pervasive self-tracking, there are just hundreds of apps, health trackers, programs to, as Salomé puts it, contract out the essential functions of one's body to a piece of software. And fertility and reproductive tracking is no different. There are dozens of apps and devices to track menstrual cycles, basal body temperature, ovulation, chart changes in cervical fluid, and trace the development of the fetus. These services tend to fall into the category of femtech, which is digital health services supporting a range of women's health issues. Reproductive, and sexual health services make up about 40% of that market. The industry is fairly new and small, but growing. So the total market size accounted for about $40.2 billion in 2020, but is projected to grow sort of rapidly. So to give you a flavor of a few of the different kind of apps that are out there, there's, I have a little cluster there, icons here. So there are apps like Clue, Flow, Ovia, and Flow. They collect things like your input data on menstrual cycle, age, weight, basal body temperature, sexual activity, cervical fluid. You can track symptoms like head or body aches, mood changes, sleeping patterns, energy level, sex drive, and food cravings. And so this is the kind of information that's typically collected here. And some of them are quite commonly used. So Flow has been downloaded over 180 million times. It bills itself as the #1 mobile product for women's health. Some of them also kind of follow people through their whole kind of life cycle. So Ovia offers a range of apps that sort of cover the cycle from conception to early parenthood, and let users track, move from sort of tracking their menstrual cycle and sort of fertility processes through monitoring baby's development milestones and tracking and sharing kind of early developmental milestones. So those are just apps where people are sort of volunteering this information and sort of downloading it and registering it in this way. But fertility data is also in other places like IoT devices, search history, communications. And unsurprisingly, there's been some shady practices that have arisen in this space. So they have been sort of periodically found to engage in some scammy behavior. So common with all kinds of digital services, one problem here is that there's real lack of choice. So this is like a quick little search I did for basal body temperature tracking. You really can't find one that doesn't come with like a built-in app. Like this, just like all 3 of these 4 include a picture of a phone, built-in app. So sort of a limited choice to just engage in the collection for yourself and not have it kind of be datafied. But there's sort of other problems here. So in 2021, the FTC settled a case against the largest of these companies, Flow. They promised to keep their data private. Obviously, they didn't. They shared it with Facebook's analytics, Google, apps, Flyer, Flurry, a bunch of data analytics companies that they were sharing information with, including the fact of a user's pregnancy, which is bad. And I think this should come as no surprise. Just sort of thinking about the market structure behind all of this. Companies are collecting data about pregnancy because pregnancy is an extremely valuable kind of moment of change in a consumer's life, where they change all of their shopping behavior, all of their kind of consumptive patterns. And so other industries are just extremely interested in sort of when this kind of change happens. So there's kind of this famous case of Target marketing to a teen girl sort of pregnancy materials to her before she had even told anyone in her family that she was pregnant. This is kind of a famous case here. Insurers are very interested in who's going to experience an expensive and disruptive life event. So data can be used to lead to higher life insurance premiums, interest rate loans, and employers are, of course, and prospective employers are very interested in who we're about to experience an expensive and disruptive life event. I won't go on too much longer, but I just want to say sort of, after Dobbs, there's been sort of a notable uptick in legal attention in sort of fertility information, fertility data. Early commentators are sort of particularly focused on the privacy risk this data poses in a post-Roe world, and the capacity for law enforcement in states without abortion protection to access users' fertility data. And that risk is not, totally unfounded. So there's this company called Heartbeat International. They're an Ohio-based organization that runs thousands of anti-abortion clinics. They offer a national database data collection and sharing system. So this is a quote from their website that I think is just kind of extraordinary. So the goal here is for these companies to collect and store ultrasound photos, income, history of abuse and relationship, addiction, history of drug use, STI history, medical history, and share it and put it in a national database to really kind of inform the entire movement. So yeah, they're really sort of compiling and keeping a record here. So just kind of I guess I'll just turn a little bit to some sort of potential analyses here. I think in response to these concerns, legal conversations tend to kind of go one of 2 ways. So one is really focused on sort of minimizing the data to provide to apps to begin with to reduce that law enforcement risk, looking at our privacy rules, how robust they protect access to this information. So there's been some legislative pushes to try to sort of minimize this data collection to begin with. The My Body, My Data Act, the 4th Amendment and Not for Sale Act were both sort of proposed in response to these kinds of risks. And then there are like the FTC actions that are sort of releasing violations in the promises that companies make when they actually share this information. But I think there are sort of 2 issues with this predominant way of thinking about what's the problem here and what to do about it. The first is that fertility data is not an information category, like X data is pregnancy data. I really think of it as like a status insight, like X person is pregnant or likely is going to become pregnant. And those are really kind of distinct. And it's only really worth having this conversation about fertility data because the status insight that this person is pregnant or likely to become pregnant doesn't just have biological meaning, but like profound social meaning. And I think this point is frequently quite fundamentally misunderstood in a lot of our legal responses. And I think it leads to things just simply being missed. Beyond kind of traditional reproductive data, all kinds of things can reveal pregnancy status. So I like to say which pregnancy will tell on you. So in the first trimester, people who are pregnant experience significant hormone changes, and this has been shown to lead to detectable changed behavioral activity in their viewing behavior on smart TVs. We don't think of smart TV viewing behavior as like fertility data, but this is like a profound constitutive transformation that's happening, and it gets picked up in the sort of datafied patterns of your life. And so, I think that is just obtaining that insight is sort of speaks to this sort of category change. And like other status insights, its character depends not just on data that's harvested from you, but on sort of the social salience and meaning of gender status in our country. So maybe I'll pause there because I'm pretty so tired. Yeah, just really interested in kind of thinking through these questions a bit more. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Salomé. That was awesome. And thank you, Amy, for moderating and for doing LPE. This is amazing. And to Corinne and Raul and Sanjay and everyone else, thank you so much. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the LPE frame has been really generative for me in the gender context, and thinking about these particularized health concerns that I've been writing about, from AIDS to COVID and abortion. My broader work right now is thinking about how competing ideologies, economic ideologies, ideas around expertise, sort of shape the economy and health. And I'm really interested in how questions of expert claims and facts emerge from these larger set of political conditions. Some of them, of course, grounded of course, in questions of the economy. And I thought for today I would present a chapter of my book that I haven't presented quite as much, that traces a set of ideas that emanated out of law economics, and both became a foil for feminist activism, as well as a model for engagement for feminists. In other words, to point to a moment of convergence between law and economics and feminism, which I think had a really big impact in sort of the move towards the individualization of public health responses over structural responses. I started this work in the AIDS context, and then Jason Jackson and I wrote a couple papers in the COVID context, and I thought I'd bring those in and end by asking some questions about how to think about this conversation, this relationship between law, gender, economics, and the ideologies that surround all of them in the context of abortion. So just to quickly tell you how I get to the chapter I'm talking about, because it's a little hard to understand, I think, if I don't say the first bit, but in a minute. The first two chapters of my book describe how feminist lawyers and advocates essentially mobilized to change the definition of AIDS being used by the CDC in the mid 1980s to early 1940s. And I tell a story of how social movement actors, feminists, and others mobilized to destabilize emerging scientific consensus and demand that they too seem to be AIDS. And my contribution here is that they is in social movements and health literature that people, lawyers and advocates don't just mobilize expertise to bring about legal change. They actually use the law to destabilize expert consensus, and it's a sort of construction of knowledge story, but with law playing a heavy role. So feminists, I say at the end of chapter 2, they accomplished this goal. They convinced the Centers for Disease Control to change their definition of AIDS. They changed their definition in 1992. The WHO follows in 1993. There's windfall diagnosis for women living with HIV, and there's a new idea in the world that AIDS is actually going to be a heterosexual epidemic. And at this particular moment in the early 90s, there's other big transformations going on that I am which is that first, after nearly chasing a decade of theories about why gay men or drug users might be especially vulnerable to getting HIV. Epidemiologists are sort of lost in grappling with how to think through what it means to study a heterosexual epidemic. And then second, there's a transformation inside of epidemiology in the 90s. More feminists become epidemiologists. You have the rise of Marshall and Barnhill's feminist epidemiology. So the science of public health is changing. And law also, particularly through the government regulation of behavior, and of course, in the IP context, there's probably a entirely different parallel story going on here that I'm not exactly tapped into. But law becomes central to understanding how to do public health governance, and this happens, I think, both in the United States but also globally, as law becomes important to rule of law and development projects. And this is something that Alvaro Santos and David Shuback have written a lot about. So in chapter 3, the chapter that I was going to focus on today, I focus in on this third piece: how does law get imagined as a response to AIDS? And I think this is a history of ideas project. This chapter considers how essentially transformations in how legal scholars are imagining law as a way to manage epidemics, and internshiping the knowledge environment around how to do public health. And I focus in on a debate that turns out to be very influential between law and economics scholars Richard Posner and Thomas Phillipson, and feminists, including Catherine McKinnon and Ingrid Jordan, to show how they sort of center in on this idea of sex bargain. So Richard Posner and Thomas Phillipson, who had wrote a ton on AIDS. Richard Posner really wrote quite a lot on AIDS, and he had also written Sex and Reason at this point, which was a very big book on sort of economic theories of sex. And they write in 1992 that we should treat risky sexual behavior as a market in which trading takes place under uncertainty about conditions about quality. So this core concept goes on to provide the foundation for their book, published in 1993, Private Choices in Public Health, the AIDS Epidemic and Economic Perspective. In other words, they're saying that sex is a market. In the chapter, I call this sex bargain. Dominant feminists at this time are very, very powerful. There's a growing movement around sexual violence. They see the subordination of women by men as a constant and changing universal issue in women's lives. But they have a different idea. HIV is a product of women's sexual oppression by men. The domination of women by men shape women's ability to participate in the sex bargain. Law and economics did not like this. Law and economists did not like this feminist take, and they directly engaged with them. They were actively sort of engaging with feminist ideas. And they say, rather than coercion as a background condition that leads people to make bad choices in this market transaction we call that, we should see the challenges faced by women as an issue of market choice determined by supply and demand. And to drive home this point, Posner and Phillipson use the example of heterosexual relationships in the Black community. Posner and Phillipson argue that Black women are at high risk of contracting HIV because of the supply problem. There are not enough Black men. According to Posner and Phillipson, I mean, reading it today, it's really almost feels offensive to read. This is what they say, because Black women have fewer options to choose from, Black men can demand more risky sex for less compensation to Black women. Or according to Posner and Phillipson, I quote, just by being willing to have a relationship with her. They are responding to feminists, but they're also trying to save their own theory. They say to argue, and this is directly in response to the feminist critique, that the low effective sex ratio among Blacks coerces women to engage in unprotected sex would be tantamount to regarding all market transactions as coerced, since they're determined by, among other things, the relative number of suppliers and demanders. So they're like, if I acknowledge coercion here, then I have to basically throw out my whole theory. So by arguing, as I said, that gender equality is a supply and demand issue and not a power issue, they essentially evade the entire issue of a pre-existing distribution of power, money, resources that also bargaining by women, and of course, a very important critique of law and economics that comes out of critical legal theory over time. So in the chapter, I not only talk about how these scholars debate with each other, but how they take their ideas into the real world. Posner and Phillipson go to the World Bank, who take up their ideas wholesale. In the World Bank, one of the first World Bank reports on AIDS, the entire first few paragraphs of the report is basically the summary of public health private choices in the book jacket of Posner's book. And feminists, because of this moment, is the 1990s, violence against women activists past, violence against women is gaining the idea that there's a thing called violence against women is gaining momentum. They have the idea that sexual violence leads to AIDS. They reproduce, though, the sex bargain, as I try to argue in the chapter. They too focus in on the moment of negotiation as the point in which to fix it. While they're concerned about structural realities, in truth, the political moment that we're in, deregulation, personal responsibilities, the 1980s and 90s, the rise of the carceral state, essentially all line up to help sort of forward the idea that where we should be focusing on in an AIDS response is the individual sort of negotiation between a man and a woman in the heterosexual context. So when all this, I was writing all this up and then COVID happened, and I was thinking about how some of the responses to COVID are so individualized, and Jason Jackson and I began to work on two different articles, and in one article we were trying to think about, well, how is this response to are we seeing the same thing basically? Is the individualized response that emerged from AIDS basically what we're seeing in COVID? Of course, we saw the decimation of the public health infrastructure in the 1980s and 90s, and we're suffering through that. But it was also so ironic, the individualistic tendencies that we were seeing in COVID. So wear a mask, wash your hands, and you can use the sort of extreme example of Flint, Michigan, which is how we start our paper, where you're telling people to wash their hands, but there's no water. So what are people to wash their hands with exactly? To show that we have these sort of structural realities that needed to be attended to, but it was like the public health response couldn't even bring it into the discourse of how to respond to the pandemic. And so you get that. How does that law economics mode sort of travel, has now sort of theme, how has it traveled into the COVID context? And even where we see developments in law economics, like towards behavioral economics, which is sort of taking over public health, you get this sort of individualistic response. Focal point is still always the individual. And in the second article, we explore a similar set of dynamics, but how it has enabled essentially the exceptionalization of the home as a site of public health intervention. So really early in the pandemic, when essential workers essentially were getting COVID at high numbers, it would make a lot of sense to really send everyone air purifiers, for example, or focusing on this and also focusing on intra-home risk mitigation strategies. But that was basically absent again from the public health discourse. And there we take closer and closer again, this sort of individualist tendencies. And also this idea that Poser and Phillipson are relying on, that there are people react differently in different settings and in different moments in the market. Some people as altruists and sometimes as egoists. I won't go into the HIV/AIDS context here, but what's important is that if you trace that idea of altruism back, it goes back to Gary Becker and sort of theories about family market, and it goes back even further to Adam Smith and this idea that sometimes you act rationally, sometimes you act more familiar. The family, the home is a site of a sort of different type of market interactions. And we sort of hypothesized there that part of what was going on when we de-exceptionalized the home is that you get this sort of replaying again of this idea that people are acting altruistically in the home. The state doesn't actually need to intervene into the home. Then the Dobbs decision came down, as we all know, the Dobbs decision overturned the federal right to abortion. There's a lot to say about the case, but I'll just end here with a few questions. But this, I think thinking about all these questions in the registered political economy these past 2 years, was begged the question of how do you think about abortion now in the registered political economy? And I think one way to understand Dobbs is to see it once again as a public health entitlement. From this perspective, that Dobbs decision is part of a longer trend that individuals take responsibility for yourselves. But this is again allows for the privatization of health services. That of course has been going on in the abortion, jurisprudence since the 1970s, when the court basically said, in Maher v. Roe and Harris v. McRae, that we have no responsibility for you. We didn't cause you. The state doesn't cause your poverty. You have to take care of yourself. And so we can support pregnancy even where we don't support abortion services. And so it follows that trajectory. I think another way of reading Dobbs is through sort of the lens of neoliberal penality. So, once we retracted the sort of idea, which was offering support, you could say, for this, what many legislators are doing anyways, which is restricting abortion services, it's been coupled with an increase of abortion regulation for criminal law. And so I think you have to be attended to that sort of criminal law dynamic as well as a sort of reproductive coercion that enables it. And then finally, there's a question which Jason and I wrote about on the LPE blog in regard to sex work, which is the question about morals and markets. And in that piece, we were really thinking about what are the political and moralized natures of markets, and how do we understand that now as essentially the market for abortion access changes, as we shift to medication abortion, as the FDA sets and regulate abortions. And there the questions would be, how do legal rules shift the distribution of power control between actors, and which societal actors win and lose, essentially, when certain things are delegitimized to criminalized, rules be governable or not. And I'll stop there. Thank you. Sorry, that's great.
So I'm Deborah.
for dinner, I'm talking to you today about difference as proxy for risk between anti-discrimination and actuarial logics. And I want to do three things, talk a little bit about how I came to this project. I'm at an early stage, so I'm excited to be thinking about it collectively, and thank you for being here. And then give you a brief historical overview, and then last talk about some of the implications of our argument. So I have a book coming out in the next year called The Sex Equality Dilemma, Work, Family, and Legal Change in the Neoliberal America. And it traces feminist legal activism from the Civil Rights Act of 1964 through the passage of the Family and Medical Leave Act, and also welfare reform in the mid-1990s. And to my surprise, this kind of led me to an interest in insurance. For a couple different reasons. A lot of the first book talks about pregnancy discrimination and debates about how to allocate the costs of reproduction. And that highlighted the salience of conflict between anti-discrimination and actuarial logics. So specifically, actuaries in a privatized insurance market tend to segregate individuals, or their purpose is to segregate individuals into group-based risk pools. Where on the other hand, in the late 20th century, you have the emergence of an anti-discrimination mandate that mandates neutrality in the face of perceived difference, whether that's biological or social or some kind of mix of both. And then also you have this question of what to do when difference costs. So both my first book project and I think this emergent project intervenes in debates about market rationality versus market irrational discrimination and accommodation, etc. So the second way in which insurance is important, and this, in many ways is an obvious point, but has to do with the limits of sex discrimination law. So coming out of my first project, feminists necessarily, as opposed to say labor feminists in the post-war era, post-World War II era, turned from social insurance to anti-discrimination law as a tool in the face of a constrained political environment, as a tool to try and achieve distributive justice. But the limits of formal equality in an environment where the courts shut down disparate impact liability depends, or the ability of formal equality to get economic security for childbearing women depends on private welfare capitalism, which of course is class bifurcated and contracting in this period as well. So those two themes are popping up in this project as well. So in this project, I'm starting to look at debates about insurance and gender and social equity and inequality. In a separate essay, I'm looking at the problem of how insurance treats unpaid familial care work, which was kind of a conundrum from the development of life insurance in the early 20th century to the present. And in this project, I'm zeroing in on debates about anti-discrimination and sex difference in the 70s and 80s. So I'll give you kind of a brief historical overview and then turn to some of the implications. The kind of overarching question here is, what is the relationship between the two broad themes I identified? One is debates about the legal right regulation of identity-based difference and actuarial thinking, so differential price premiums in the insurance market, and the relationship, and then the second theme is the relationship between private and public division in social insurance versus private insurance. And my working thesis is that the concept of actuarial fairness, which is treated, I think, as natural in the law and economics literature, that was actually a historical construct in the 1970s, and I have yet to do specific research into how it developed. But this notion that that price premiums should be differential based on risk itself reinforces the legitimacy of private markets. So the construction of sex difference is used as a tool to reinforce divides between public and private. Okay, so just turning to the history as kind of a real sketchy overview. Basically, in the mid-1970s, feminist groups such as the Women's Equity Action League started to identify and discuss
two kinds of insurance. So one kind was in the sales of insurance. So here you see remnants of coverture. They refused to sell certain kinds of policies to women, or they measured the terms of the sale by a married woman's husband. So they would sell auto insurance according to her husband's driving behavior, or they refused to sell the divorce agreement because this was just considered a bad risk. But there was also a tension. The second kind of discrimination had to do with the issue of sex as a criterion for rating, which is where I really want to focus. So the efforts to reform this kind of followed different kinds of strategies, from the courts to the state legislature to Congress. In the courts, they experimented with public accommodations law, which was set for I trace the effort to get sex included in state public accommodation laws in the late 60s, early 70s. But basically, it came down to a jurisdictional question. A lot of state commissions on human rights said, well, there's a different insurance regulation regime at the state level, so we don't have kind of the anti-discrimination jurisdiction under the anti-discrimination statute. Then they experimented with expansive theories of state action. So the notion that the insurance companies were licensed by the state led to kind of equal protection violation, or Section 1983 claim. This was shut down as the court foreclosed kind of a revival of expansive state action in the mid-1970s. Then they turned to what turned out to be a more powerful tool, which was for group-based plans rather than individual-based plans, that they could use Title VII as regulation because these were purchased by employers. And as many of you may know, there was a 1978 case, Los Angeles Department of Water versus Manhart, which said that the city as an employer could not charge women more or couldn't require higher contributions to their pension plan just because women on average lived longer. And then the kind of flip of that 5 years later in the Norris decision was that employers also couldn't just give women a lump sum of money, which they then used to purchase private insurance that was itself sex discriminatory. So you had with group-based plans with Title VII, the emergence of a liberal individualist conception of what was fair and what was equal under insurance regimes. At the same time, you had the decline of pensions and the rise of 401ks. So 401ks were created by Congress the same year that Manhart was decided in 1978 and expanded as an individual mechanism in 1981, and for other reasons pensions declined. And so at the state level, there's still actually a wide divergence in the allowance of sex as a criterion for different kinds of insurance. It differs between auto and property casualty life insurance. And actually, after the Manhart decision, several states that had been kind of silent on the issue of whether sex could be a criterion of life insurance policies in general passed statutes explicitly allowing sex discrimination because they were afraid that the logic of Manhart would bleed out into the individualized insurance market. So kind of what do I make of all of this? I think it's a really exciting way to study the construction of sex difference, debates about individualized versus group equity, and the relationship between the public and private. And I'm still kind of trying to work that out, all those relationships, and do a lot of the archival research around it. So any thoughts you have would be appreciated. But what really fascinates me is that the law review literature in the mid-1980s that was defending the position that the majority of the court took in Manhart, which was a liberal feminist position, it was that people should be treated as individuals despite the group average or the group median. There were interesting, what I found really fascinating law and econ responses to that this was an aleatory contract about future risk rather than other cases where you could actually measure the capacities of the individual against the stereotype. But the position that defended Manhart said that the reason Manhart was correct is because of affirmative action and disparate impact liability and other group-based conceptions of Title VII and anti-discrimination law more broadly are wrong. And so I haven't yet done enough archival research to figure out what advocacy groups were thinking about that tension. And if they were thinking of it, I think they probably were. In the late 70s, early 80s. So that's one question that interests me just from a historical perspective. But I think it provides an interesting kind of a set of normative questions about, is it possible to reach the liberal individualist position while preserving commitments to group-based equity in other contexts? Or, does it actually force us to question whether the liberal individualist position in the insurance debates was correct? And so that's kind of where I'm leaving this. And again, this concept of actuarial fairness was basically that if you don't price individuals according to their risk pool, there's going to be regulatory adverse selection, meaning people will buy into the pool because it exists, even though they're too high of a risk hazard. There will therefore be a death spiral exit from the market of insurance companies. Again, I think that depends on the logic of a privatized market rather than a form of social insurance where there wouldn't be competitive disadvantages and advantages between companies and the possibilities of exit. Because there would be a single insurer. But that kind of set of debates, the relationship between the construction of difference, individual group equity, and this idea of the divide between the public and private is what I'm trying to sort through.
Great. So really 3 wonderful projects. And just to say maybe one thing, just that I noticed in hearing these presentations, and then one question that I'll start us off with. So one is really interesting way in which attending to gender might help reveal the sort of fundamental kind of coercion inherent in market relations. So to really see that in Aziza's lovely story about Richard Posner. But I think while often in sort of political economy circles we talk about the kind of coercion fundamental to market society through the lens of worker starve, right, sort of hunger or property, that some of these other kinds of coercion that you guys are bringing in, very sort of subtle ones about how the law constructs insurance markets or how the law constructs reproductive rights, that all of those might be really important ways of talking about that kind of coercive apparatus that underlies market relations and how it differs, obviously, depending on your sort of ascribed gender status. So I guess one question I thought maybe interesting to hear all of you talk about is, so obviously you're writing in different settings, but in some ways one sort of unifying question might be how would or did liberal feminists talk about the problem that you're interested in? So thinking about Salomé, there's a clear sort of either a privacy problem here. We need to reintroduce choice, right? That there's a kind of a and I think that's actually the narrative we've heard about. So how would a sort of liberal feminists talk about in these different settings? And I think, Debbie, to some degree, you're actually tracing how liberal feminism or how feminists had to work out in some degree what their conception of feminism was and imported ideas about sort of market individualism into that at certain moments or maybe resisted them. So how do liberal feminists think about the problems that you're talking about? And what might something that you would call socialist feminism or a social reproduction perspective or a political economy perspective, either ask questions differently or sort of pose the dilemmas differently or respond to them sort of differently. Does that make sense? Great. So
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so the liberal feminist, I mean, it's kind of an amazing moment to study the deification of biological reproduction because of Dobbs. Because I think I touched on this a little bit at the end, but the liberal feminists are sort of pushed into this bifurcated set of responses. So which just tracks the public-private distinction. So on the market side of this sort of consumer-facing digital health market, their response really has to be structured in terms of like, oh, this is bad because consumers don't have a choice. And the violation occurs if the conditions that they entered into this contractual sort of market relation under they've been lied to about those conditions. But then they sort of have this freak out when that sort of marketized digital production process like meets or like crosses the boundary into the like law enforcement like abortion scare. And it I think exposes like this really profound kind of gap in that kind of thinking, because you have all of these market forces like actively facilitating and encouraging the creation of all of this information that then becomes this sort of like minefield for all of these problems. And the only way that they can sort of think about resolving that problem is through this like sort of reimposing, reinvigorating the separation between the private activity where our problems are just about choice and informed consent, and it cannot touch and cross over the boundary to the public. Like that's where the risk success or the problems are. Which is just yeah, so they're sort of in this like moment of breaking down or freaking out post Trump's. In terms of how a socialist conception might be quite different. I mean, I think again, it's just a sort of simple point that, you know, I think sort of constructivists and also more socialist feminists just think is intuitive, which is that, you know, what we're in the business of when we're like datafying all of these insights is just sort of like profoundly recreating our social status that is like thickly socially constituted. And what determines the sort of recursive, like we're apprehending facts about us, and that's sort of rematerializing or entrenching sort of our social status and the political conditions. And that is true. That's not like a private public sort of distinction. That has to do with sort of the social status and political conditions that we're sort of realizing and rendering visible kind of in our datafied in datafying sort of the social conditions of our lives. And I think it points us much more to focus on kind of like the status of those political conditions. So, you know, we should maybe be suspect of how insightful we can or how great our sort of fertility and reproductive health insights can be in marketized form. And the solution is maybe not like a data governance solution, but like more of a like universal healthcare sort of solution. So it's very preliminary thoughts, but yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks for that question. I have another question as well. I think I would answer in 3 different ways. So one is that, you know, in this moment where everyone's turning to law in or this is how I describe the moment anyways. I see it as a moment where law is becoming more central and important to how do we regulate public health, how do we regulate behavior in the context of public health. The liberal feminists are basically leading into this, right? This is the moment where the feminists are turning from radical to liberal anyways. It's the 1970s, 80s that de-radicalize. There's sort of you lose the idea that there's going to be like a feminist colony somewhere. We sort of feminists re-enter the state. You know, you see this in a lot of different places in the work of it. And so in one ACLU report, for example, written by a very prominent feminist law professor a very long time ago, you know, she says sex between 2 gay men is equal, and sex between a man and a woman is inherently unequal. And what flows from that is then how do we regulate sex between men and women to make it more equal, to essentially change bargaining power in the relationship. But then we're also in our, you know, 1980s, 1990s, the rise of sort of sexual violence moment for feminism and feminists, and this is really well documented in Viljoen's book. You know, there's turn to criminal law and the background project, the sort of neoliberalism, this sort of background economic order, and you get the full-fledged, I mean, for some people, not everyone, but you get this kind of like embrace of the criminal legal system as an opportunity to rework problems. So that's also going on in the as political feminists in the moment that I'm describing. But there's this other thing that's happening that Debbie's project made me think of, which is that there's a much larger struggle happening around knowledge production about women. In 1973, there was a ban on essentially including women in large research studies because of potential harm to fetus drug development studies. And there's this big feminist battle that ties directly into the AIDS struggle, because it turns out that when AIDS drugs get rolled out and AZT turns out to be pretty toxic, there's a lot of experimental medication being rolled out, and none of the women living with HIV could enroll in experimental trials. So that movement sort of dovetails with the broader feminist women's health movement project. And then you get the famous pregnancy, the case, I'm not thinking of the United Johnson, right,
Yeah.
Johnson, and basically Johnson, they're saying, oh, well, women can choose to take risks with their pregnancy essentially, and it appears when the FDA redrafted guidance, basically saying, oh no, women ought to be able to enroll in these clinical trials. It's all sort of hinging on this idea that, well, now women, like our conception of women are these sort of autonomous agents who can choose their risk, and one of the places they can choose their risk is in the context of pregnancy. The Supreme Court says so we ought to actually modernize our rules around clinical trial research as well. So you get all these different divergent moments. I think the political economy, like what do you get with the political economy story question is, so I'm thinking about that a lot. In some ways it's like once you start doing the political economy stuff, you're like, oh, what else is it? Why wasn't I doing this? What was I focused on? This is all the background conditions and structures that I should have been talking about. And then at the same time, it's kind of, I actually found it a little difficult in my work to say, like, okay, how do we hold on to the instability that seeing and taking a critical perspective of the political economy, of the economy, while holding on to sort of a moving story about gender, a moving story about science, and a moving story, and sort of trying to express that everything is so unstable all the time, and we just land in different moments, in different times, in different places, and then it all gets disrupted again in a new political moment, or with a new expert, or sort of a new idea that might emerge in the world and reshape things and reshape how we ask our questions in economics and in science and in so it's been hard, I think, actually, to sort of to hang on to all of that at the same time, and write something that sounds coherent also, but sorry.
So I think for me, this question kind of traces also a theme that I've looked at in other work, which is the relationship between the rise of sex discrimination law and neoliberalism. So I've looked at that with like fathers' rights and the privatization of child support, or the end of maternalist labor laws and push back against an effort to extend them. And so I think the question here is, how does the liberal feminist position get tied into reinforcing actuarial thinking? So the historian Haley Horan, and a really interesting Nicole Deborah, kind of argues that feminists were still talking about numbers and still kind of buying into actuarial logic. So the way they responded in the Manhart opinion, or the debates, the litigation, was to say your numbers are wrong, which is was a big part of the discourse around the pregnancy discrimination cases, Goodell v. Yale and General Electric v. Gilbert too. So you're relying on old data, you're relying on data, that's outdated now that more women are working or. But the problem with that is that you get to, with certain things like lifespan, like you have to acknowledge an irreducible difference at some point. So insurers kept coming back with data. Sure, some of it was wrong, but some of it was like, well, across time and space, women have always lived. Obviously, this is changing to some degree here, but so you kind of reinforce the notion that the difference should be the side of price differential. So I guess the socialist, maybe in a socialist alternative, would respond on two axes. One would have to do with kind of the expressive value of the law and the social identities that are created through law, and then the other would be more kind of materialist on economic security. So on the social solidarity, I think there's a lot of historical scholarship that looks at other arenas, employment, education, housing as being sites for the construction of identity. And insurance, we've done that to a lesser extent, but insurance and the idea of differentiation across risk is definitely a site here for the construction of group identity. A socialist alternative might emphasize solidarity, that the purpose is not to classify according to difference, but rather to socialize risk across differences. And then my working hypothesis on this actuarial fairness bit is that the whole concept of regulatory adverse selection and the death spiral, and I know I have to read more on the insurance, I'm learning the insurance literature as I go, I responded to this in the healthcare context, but depends on the private market. So if we had a public insurer, there would be no competition, no exit, right? So I think so that's kind of my thoughts on this.
Just one thought is like one interaction between the stuff that Salomé's doing and sort of where the conversation moved is sort of thinking about how datafication challenges the the sort of idea of groups at all at some level, and sort of challenges the sort of liberal feminist move of sort of saying, well, like, treat a group in that way is about stereotype, or your numbers are wrong, right? Like once you can get the numbers right, one of the things that happens is in some sense, one, you don't need to use gender or race anymore for categorization, you just use everybody's individual degree to which gender and race are baked into whatever else is revealed about their TV watching habits or their their exposure to the criminal justice system, right? So it's like hyper individualizing it. Part of what it does is reveals group subordination, yes. Right? And so how that is going to sort of play into the kind of emerging debates about how we should think about market risk regulation, socialization of risk versus the individualization of risk seems to me like a really important question. But I want to turn it over to the audience and see if you all have questions or thoughts that you want to share. Or did you want to all say something about that first while you guys are all thinking?
Yeah, I mean, like. That's exactly, a little bit part of what you see is that in this sort of hyper-personalization kind of move that has datafication, precisely what you are baking in is just like rediscovering, like, that's what it means to live in a society where we are like reliably subordinating people on the basis of gender. And I closed with that Viljoen Moderator tweet about control over reproduction being sort of a precondition of political equality. And when that has been sort of taken away, and you sort of think about sort of the political, economic, and social status of women or other people who can become pregnant, sort of that precondition being taken away, and that resulting in a change. Like one way that change or diminishment is occurring is via data about reproduction. Like it becomes this newly dangerous mode through which that sort of loss of status can get sort of worked through and like materialized in like a lot of different social forms, and that will in turn be used to sort of entrench and map subordinated status. And it makes me think a little bit of something that you raised, which is like what it puts you in the like condition of social subordination where you're like damned if you do, damned if you don't. You can retrieve or sort of walk back from producing information about reproduction and fertility that down the line might actually be extremely useful for people who are interested in understanding this like profound biological change that's happening to their bodies, like particularly again, early stage in this research around like reading a lot about trans men who want to understand their processes of trying to become pregnant. It's like a severely under-researched community that is also now feels like severely at risk in trying to fool or understand those processes. So it's like the more sort of on the sliding scale of marginalization you're in, there's also just like a lot less understanding of reproduction and that process for you. And again, it just puts you in this like damned if you do, damned if you don't position, which to me just like, yes, that's what it means to be in a subordinated system position. So anyway, time was less here.
I was just going to react quickly to this. There's this interesting parallel between what you're saying and the statification conversation and what you see happening in medicine in general, which is the sort of, I don't know what the exact term, but like the term to genetic medicine essentially, where you get this like hyper localized intervention that sort of both elides the idea that there are structural conditions at play in people's genetic makeup, and yet allows you to personalize, and yet, you can then extrapolate to group difference, but how much should we be doing that if it's all about genetic medicine, and there's this constant like back and forth. But there's also this way that everything gets rebiologized. So like the example I always think about is like, breast cancer rates in, Black women are extraordinarily high. Is it because many Black women have lived in toxic dump sites, or is it because, poor housing conditions and poor access to water, et cetera, or is it because there's something genetically different about this population? And then it sort of, in the way that you said, like, oh, if you're menstruating, you watch different shows on TV, there's this like rebiologization, this idea that your whole makeup and constitution is like somehow, and in a way it is, right? But then you have to be able to think about that as constructed as well, and we lose sight of that social constructed once we turn to the datafication of
that's really fascinating. I think the relationship between the liberal feminist position and the datafication is really interesting. I think it pushes in a slightly different direction. So I think in the debates about Manhart and insurance, the liberal feminist position was accelerating datafication, because what they were saying is that the insurance companies shouldn't look at the women as a group. What they should look at is all these individual factors: smoking, driving patterns, social patterns, etc. And so
Race and accurately.
yes, yeah. So the response was to go hyper individual. So even as I'm critical of the construction of group difference for insurance, I do find myself wondering, which is a slightly uncomfortable position, but whether this socialist feminist position might be more like unique groups in order to regulate and to support. I think it ties into interesting questions about the use of statistical difference in anti-discrimination law at this time, because you also have debates about disparate impact, incomparable worth, both of which also, in order to get equity, you need to classify the group as a whole. So again, slightly uncomfortable for me, but some of the normative takeaway I'm getting from the project is against the individualization of
It's not inconsistent with other conversations over the past couple of days, whether thinking about labor as like a distinctive social relation that then has to be thought about as a group, right? Some of our conversations about race and the decarceration of the welfare system, right? That like it seems to me that somebody, but I could see the discomfort, but also like the resonance across other conversations the last couple of days. Great.
Thanks so much, everyone, for your presentations, for your comments. So I wanted to kind of invite you all to complicate the story a little bit more along another axis, which of course you're going to hear me say disability, right? And so, Salomé, for you, it's the datification of disability would be welcome, because there's not information or data out there. There's this privacy veil that has not been pierced over time and has been left intact. And Aziza, we've talked about the construction of expertise in this space, and what counts as expertise really tied into the medical model piece there. And when you talk about this particular chapter, I'd like to hear more about where disability fits in that story. And Debbie, for you, I mean, the conception of risk and disability, either in the kind of insurance story, is incredibly complicated all the way through the Achasabal case, in 2002 in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is saying, how do we think about risk with respect to workers with disabilities, and can they assume the risk? Should we allow them to assume the risk? How do we kind of figure this out? All the way through the ACA, where it's like, finally, as an anti-discrimination measure, pre-existing conditions should not dictate access to insurance. And so I think there's a complicated story with disability category A, and then B, when you see it intersectionally with gender, that gender story gets complicated, right? Because there are women with disabilities that are going through this time in the 70s and 80s, but the regulation of their activities perhaps doesn't really begin to change until the 90s, right after the APA, and then into 2000 to 2008. So I just wondered if you could maybe, those of you who feel like there's a response in there, but just kind of inviting you to see disability within the stories that you're telling.
I'm just thinking.
Okay, I think, so the first, thanks, Justin. So the first, two, chapters of my book really is in the register of disability. I think very differently from the disability conversations that are going on today, but very much grounded in, the fact that what was the idea that women should have, should be essentially getting diagnosed with HIV sort of emerged from the fact that at the time in the 1980s, Social Security insurance and Social Security disability insurance was essentially giving people presumptive benefits if they had an AIDS diagnosis. So the reason people weren't able to get that disability was because women didn't have an AIDS diagnosis. Why did they have the AIDS diagnosis? Because the Social Security Administration was using the CDC's definition. The CDC's definition didn't include gynecological infections. And so is the story of how, and so in there, that required like a really big exposition of, what is disability anyways, and how is it really not a supportive service, and should AIDS be a disability, which is, the early Brad in, right, the early HIV cases are about like how do you adjudicate essentially AIDS as a disability issue. And this chapter, and it's interesting, your question is making me realize how little it appears in any of the debates I've read, like it's sort of absent from, except to say that at the same time, pregnancy is being thought of or, sort of adjudicated on the register of disability. And so that's something I think interesting to think about there. But certainly when it comes to the Posner-McKinnon debate I was describing, I would say disability was entirely absent from that conversation. And I'm sure, and I haven't read it, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's been written by Posner himself, since he took on every topic, and offered a market perspective on it. But I'm gonna go back and check, was there some sort of a parallel debate happening around disability or deficiencies?
I mean, just one thought, I don't know the last time you read Posner's piece on adoption.
Oh, right,
There's an incredible piece that he writes with a co-author about the market for adoption.
Right.
That not only says that that we should liberate the market in adoption, but effectively argues that every baby needs to be priced according to their market value,
Right.
so that because of the glut of, they didn't use that word, the glut of Black babies in the adoption market and disability, and so it's like not really mentioning market data adoption, but the individual pricing according to levels of ability and racial identity of babies. So it's a really remarkable piece where you do start to see some of the way that disability gets written into the story.
Absolutely. And it's interesting to think about that with regards to that Alito footnote, that we need more babies for the adoption market, essentially, that's in dogs. It's great.
Yeah, I thank you for the question. I think it's really important and kind of baseline answers that I need to do a lot more work here on learning. So I hope to be in conversation. I think thinking about the feminist movement and just the disability movement, disability justice movement in relationship to each other could be really generative. I trace a lot that turn to temporary disability as an analogy for pregnancy. But it's really a formalist move because it's using an existing personnel HR category in order to try and lift that pregnancy into existing employment benefits through anti-discrimination law. Instead of thinking where the disability movement, I think, ultimately got, which is thinking more about accommodation and cost redistribution. And feminists were specifically using that analogy to oppose the idea that full inclusion of other and women in the workplace really costs extra. So I think, I think it's really fascinating that maybe there's some of the sociological divides between women that had a lot to do with bias, limited the conception of feminist equality.
It's a great question. I think I was struck first of all, foremost with like the sort of fraught historic relationship between like pregnancy status and disability status. And again, early stage work, so just preliminary thoughts. I imagine that once you start to bring in disability into how I'm thinking through kind of the damned if you do, damned if you don't calculus. It's like it amplifies on both counts because people who are interested in becoming pregnant who are also disabled also feel probably pervasively underrepresented in any of the sort of research or any of their experience in sort of a formal medical establishment, which would push them to the sort of marketized, personalized alternatives. On the other hand, they're facing far greater risk of apprehension on the other side. So that's sort of just my first take at how it doesn't necessarily, it just sort of like amplifies the stakes on and the tensions on both counts. But it does also make me think a little bit about that was something that you were talking about in the actuarial sense and the claims about, you know, hey, it strikes me as, you know, I mean, again, there's sort of the drive to biologize or create the group claim to equal pay. Like, you need the group to ground the claim. Like, why are these individuals pervasively underpaid, and why is it a form of pervasive underpayment that we ought address? You know, and that also is, I think, going to intersect in very sort of interesting and complicated ways with rewriting the disability, right? Because it plausibly produces distinct normative claims and distinct group formations to ground those kinds of things. So that's just preliminary.
Great. Thanks. I just want to jump in and not to go off this into a disability conversation, but you know, what's interesting to me, and I read a lot about disability and family regulation and datification, that is a sphere where disability is being datified really concretely.
Yeah.
And for a long time, I was part of the group of folks who thought we must identify the number of people with disabilities in the family regulation system. But actually, as soon as I started really working on that project with social scientists, I was like, whoa, this is just amplifying risk everywhere in the way that I think your research on datification and social status really gets to. And I have, it just sort of, I think, is extra complicated because we don't know how to define disability as like a, we just never come up with what that means. And a lot of people mean it solely almost as a social status and as a label, and it sort of is a socially constructed category in such a broad way. So I don't know, you guys have given me a lot to think about, and I'm not sure I've actually asked a question, except I'm curious, Salomé, how you would think about that, and if it's, I think you would agree, but I'm interested in sort of, if I don't completely understand, I think that also the level you do, sort of how AI functions in this space, how you understand that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think particularly, I would want to know a lot more kind of about how people in the disability space sort of think about the sort of boundaries of the social status production there, and if there are like stakes or value in sort of in the biological or sort of medical remedicalization of certain, even just like drawing distinctions within, or sort of, and where those sort of like meaningfully pick up on social or material distinctions within the community, because that in turn to me like toggles the sort of value risk calculus of legibility or apprehension. But you know, I think behind all of that, like once you sort of then do your apprehending and then re-inscribing or enacting the categories in automated ways, like again, it's just would want to know so much more about the context in which that's happening and the purposes for which that sort of like reenactment and like ascribing the categories and then sort of using the automated system to sort of formalize and act back on the category is happening. But yeah, that's just kind of my first impressions. Amy, maybe also.
Well, no, it just made me think that like something that's come up again over the last couple of days is that that the sort of idea also for who's in control of these, like this machinery, right? Who's in control of the way that data is being organized and categorized. And one of the things sort of, I think that this, you know, is on the table from this panel is both the sort of desire for a kind of democratization of it. Like what if we had a universal insurance? What if we had sort of data being gathered for the purposes of the disability community wanted to make legible? And yet also sort of highlights one of the ways which like one of the main institutions we've had for trying to do that using the state, you know, has also been very problematic, precisely given the way that forms of power kind of run through the state, and so, like reproductive choice, for example, today, as an example of how the formation of our political institutions, the ability to get majoritarianism, kind of parts of the country, given gerrymandering, right, like that all gets run through, and investigated it out, whether or not in fact majoritarian positions to protect abortion people get expressed, and anyway, so, just a thought that I wanted to,
Yeah, 3 amazing presentation topics. I was so struck by Deborah's line about what happens when difference costs, and I find this fascinating. I think difference inevitably probably does cost, but maybe we have a choice about what social level we aggregate those differences and the resulting costs. And so I agree that Horizon should be a universal pooling of risk. But on our way there, I'm curious how you each think about possible other ways to pool our responsibilities for our inevitably different costs and all the ways in which we can differ as people. So, I also wonder about this as both as a tool of pooling our risks, but also perhaps as a way of creating political solidarity and community at the various social formations where we could share our risk, whether it's family, workplace, neighborhood, other federal policies. And so particularly pensions rather than 401ks, public health risk strategies rather than individualized risk strategies, de-identifying individual health data. And so I'm kind of vexed how to think about this, because on the one hand, there's risk, I think, in exacerbating the existing vulnerabilities between all of those groups I just mentioned, versus on the other hand, building political solidarity within each of those units if we measure and aggregate our differences in costs at those levels. So curious how you might think about that.
It's a really tough question. I don't have an answer yet. I think a lot about employment benefits. I think we move away from pooling costs, or we do so uncomfortably. There is the rise at this time of kind of what's called cafeteria style benefits, so individual choice within the think moves in that opposite direction. I think a lot about on the way in studying childcare, the demand for local monies for childcare cooperatives, and on the way to hopefully a right to federally funded but community controlled childcare. So maybe kind of local cooperative moves instead of always thinking about the universal and the federal. But I haven't thought enough about how that might play out in your specific.
that is the origin of insurance.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I'm gonna just say something annoying, I suppose, which is, the point is, like, which differences cost itself tells us a lot about which differences are the ones indexing durable forms of social inequality. So, to me, it's exactly like identifying those differences that are costly. That's like telling us a lot, and like mapping, like, say, useful features of our social structure that we ought to be like pushing back and working against. So my just vulgar reductive answer is like, this is why I'm a big fan of just like universal social programs that socialize cost, because it helps to sort of, not create these moments of potential political formation and consciousness and resentment against the differences that cost, but and actually sort of are a material expression, which is like social solidarity. But that, that's not telling you anything about how to get there. That's why I'm very committed to that sort of response.
I think though one complication thinking about the disability question, and also thinking about John Powell's concept of targeted universalism, is that even a sort of universalist ethic might have to account for differences that should be constructed as they may be, that have that meaning that to give every public school the same amount of money, right? So it's really that we also do need to think with our thinking about the social and material in fact nature of disability, how it's inscribed, gender, race, and then develop a sort of universalism that in fact reflects that, which is a complicated project.
I just to put in a plug for one of the 5 minutes we were just talking about yesterday, I think that part of her project is trying to do that, as I understand her vulnerability theory project, it is to say how do you replace the vulnerable subject with this vulnerable subject and reimagine that relationship between the state and and there's a whole vocabulary that accompanies it, but essentially, I think the basic impulse is to say, how do we reimagine a state's set of state, private, family, institutional relationships so that individuals have a better support system as opposed to a, depleted one.
Last question, right?
Yeah, just so much food for thought here, and I was just thinking about, I just wanted to first thank Debbie for talking about actuarial logic and thinking as opposed to actuarial fairness or science. Because I feel like that's in a lot of the health law, teaching health law sometimes it's like, because you see casebook talks all about actuarial fairness, and when I try to explain it to my students, a lot of them say, that's not fair at all. And I think it reminded me a little bit about Harcourt's work against prediction and sort of thinking about this, and that in turn reminded me of this by Jenny Anderson, comparing planning and prediction, saying that essentially a lot of the ideological support for reducing state planning was to sort of discredit the state as an entity that can reduce uncertainty and say it can't do it, it can't plan, but individuals can predict. And I feel like that to me was really resonant to me because I feel this political and policy balance of uncertainty is just really critical because I think part of what we're learning in the pandemic, and this came a lot out of Aziza's presentation as well, is just like we can't really predict a lot of risks and harms on an individual level. We can't plan for them, we can't prepare for them. And it pushes us to this more socialized vision. And that's why I also particularly appreciate Salomé's presentation because I feel like all this data collection that's being done is in the vision or the hope of like a prediction machine that can help us out in so many ways. And that comes out even in like over Lovell's book, I think, quality machine, like sort of says this machine's gonna help us, but it often won't. So I just think that this all three presentations, they help me sort of understand the nature of the difficulty of being just an individual and acting in a predictive way in a so-called fair marketplace, just doesn't exist, particularly because of its genderly racialized extraction, just this constant.
So I think maybe if you all want to have a last word, we should wrap up.
Sure, I thank you for the question. I think that, or the comment too. I think what this points towards is a questioning of insurance as a natural solution to different kinds of social and economic forms of uncertainty and insecurity. And maybe that's kind of the bigger kind of the main question here. I think we see that, say, for example, with climate change and the hurricanes in Florida, and what I've just been reading about in the newspaper about the withdrawal of the secondary insurance market, like we just run up to the limits of privatized insurance as a way of handling problems that we face. So, and that comes up in my project around homemaking labor. Like there's certain kinds of social needs and responsibilities that insurance has a hard time dealing with and subjecting to market calculation. So I think that's what your question raises.
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say thank you. No, absolutely. I mean, I'm just kind of, yeah, whatever your comments maybe it's stupid analogy, but yeah, it really, it's amazing. It makes me think that part of what you're pointing out is that insurance functions as this kind of like back end, like toxin like removal process for the marketized society. It's like a liver we're experiencing. Yeah, it's amazing. Thank you. I learned a lot.
Great, thank you guys so much.